What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Awesemo channel, talking some college football DFS picks. This is the strategy show where we go game by game, giving you a quick little breakdown of all of the DFS relevant players. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when all these strategy shows go live. We have live before locks, everything you need for college football. And make sure to check out awesemo.com where you can find our college football package. Everything from projections to slate write-ups, data, ownership, we have it all ready for you. And tonight we have another main slate. It's a really fun one, a lot of FCS games. So we are here to break down everything you need to know with some of these teams that may not be the most popular. And we'll show you some of the tools along the way. But our first game, we're going to take a look at North Carolina and Virginia Tech. It's a game that is moving towards North Carolina in the spread. They are -6.5 right now. The total is 62.5, so pretty healthy overall. Looking at some of the opportunity here for North Carolina, these are our data tools right now. It's all last year's data. These will continue to update throughout the year and become more and more useful. With last year, you have a lot of players gone from North Carolina, so some of the opportunity isn't really representative of what we expect tonight. But one thing they do return is Sam Howell at quarterback. And this is a high-powered offense, a Phil Longo offense, which is very much air raid in style. This North Carolina team is replacing a ton of production. They lose Daz Newsome and Diami Brown at receiver, Javonte Williams and Michael Carter at running back. However, they return most of their offensive line. That means they should be able to protect Sam Howell. They should be able to run the ball fairly well. And Howell is a phenomenal quarterback, one of the better quarterback prospects we have in this year's draft class. He's 8,500 in a game that does have some shootout potential. And fortunately, this game, even though it doesn't have the highest total on the slate, it's north of 60 points. And this game is projected to be close, which gives it some back and forth appeal. You don't have a situation where these guys are going to get benched at halftime. So Sam Howell still in play in stacks. Top stacking option is going to be Josh Downs, former 4-star recruit. He's at 7,200 on DraftKings. He's their top receiver, caught 7 passes last year, but did flash some big playability. He's a guy certainly to watch, a little more expensive over on FanDuel. And then the other starters listed were Emory Simmons and Antoine Green. Antoine Green is particularly cheap on DraftKings at 4,600. He's a guy that's played a lot for them in the past, but with the emergence of Daz and Diami, just didn't see as much work. And then in the backfield, you have Tennessee transfer Ty Chandler, extremely cheap on the DraftKings platform. He's a guy who's been very productive in his career, just played for an inept Tennessee offense. He's had at least 456 yards in 3 straight years for Tennessee, 58 career catches. He's an excellent price-adjusted play, specifically over on DraftKings. And then on the Virginia Tech side, you have another team implied for just shy of 30 points. So there's certainly a team you can look to. They're replacing their quarterback. Hendon Hooker transferred to Tennessee. So they have Braxton Burmeister, who is a former Oregon quarterback. He's semi-unknown, not much passing volume for Burmeister in the past, but he's obviously a high-profile recruit. And one thing we really like is he has good dual threat ability. He rushed for 193 yards on 47 attempts last year, which makes him pretty interesting in game stacks because you could run him naked, assuming that mobility transfers over. You could stack him with receivers. They return some of their top options here. Tavion Robinson is back. Trey Turner's back. Both of them had target shares north of 20%. A guy in their tight end, James Mitchell, an 18% target share. He's a player who was banged up a lot last year, but did play well when he was on the field. So he's one of the athletic receiving tight ends I think is actually in play on these slates. Again, listed at wide receiver on DraftKings. They don't have a tight end spot. The issue is their running backs. Now, they're going to rotate 3 guys. They listed Jalen Houston, Raheem Blackshear, and Keyshawn King as co-starters. The only clear option, I think, is Blackshear because he's the strongest pass catcher. He comes over from Rutgers. He did play slot receiver at times for this team. And again, I think he's more of an option on DraftKings where that PPR makes a lot of sense, and he's only 3,600 there. One last player to mention is Caleb Smith, 4,800 on DraftKings, really cheap on FanDuel where he's 5,900. He was the 3rd listed starting receiver. So he is somebody you could potentially look to as a pure dart throw within this offense. But I think mainly you want to get to the expensive options on both sides of the ball. And the best play in the game overall, I still think, is Ty Chandler from North Carolina. Our second game, we are going to pivot over to Duke taking on Charlotte. It's another ACC team. Again, in Duke, facing Charlotte. 6.5-point spread in favor of the Blue Devils. The total is 60.5, so it's another spot where you potentially have some game stacking options here. Duke has been a fairly pass-heavy team throughout their coaching staff, throughout their tenure. Now, looking at their skill position players, it gets a little dicey for Duke. They're replacing a ton of players overall, but they are going to be running out quarterback Gunnar Holmberg. Now, Gunnar Holmberg, he has just 25 career pass attempts. He was not recruited as a dual threat, but in backup duties, he has recorded positive rushing yards in each of the last 2 seasons. So perhaps Gunnar Holmberg has a little bit of hidden upside as a rusher, but Duke's offense is fast. They were 13th in plays per game. They're very pass heavy, about 50-50 pass to run ratio, and they have options that are cheap, stackable options. Jalen Calhoun, Eli Pancol, Jake Bobo. Those are clear starters on this Duke team. None of them are expensive. I don't think any of them are particularly attractive overall. They kind of are middling options. You can see nobody on Duke had a target share north of 17.5% last year. That's going to be a little hard to target, but there is upside. You can see games where Jalen Calhoun ended up with 11 targets, like Jake Bobo had targets of 6 in certain games. There are stackable, and this opponent in Charlotte is certainly beatable. Charlotte is more giving on the ground than through the air, but it is worth noting contrarian stacks with Duke, I think, are fine with Gunnar Holmberg and Calhoun, Pancol, Bobo. But again, we want to try to exploit this poor run defense for Charlotte. That is going to be done through Mateo Durant, who is quietly a lot more efficient than Deion Jackson last year, and Deion Jackson's now out of the picture. They probably use a committee with Jordan Waters involved at some capacity, but Mateo Durant was an extremely efficient player, averaged 74 rushing yards per game, even in a timeshare, and that was on a Duke offense that didn't get a lot done on the ground. Now, they have a history of running back by committee, so just watch out for this. But again, Mateo Durant, a fairly strong price-adjusted play on this particular slate. Moving over to the Charlotte side, you get the team with the 27 implied team total, so they are still somewhat relevant for DFS. Their quarterback is a returning starter in Chris Reynolds. This team leans run heavy, and Reynolds isn't very mobile, which means they're going to have to get down in this game to Duke in order for Chris Reynolds to realize his ceiling. Now, he's super cheap at $5K on DraftKings, $7,200 on FanDuel. So cheap stacks are in play here, and you do have a couple clear options that you can stack him with. Victor Tucker and Cameron Dollar are the two I want to bring up. So Victor Tucker, 5,300, he had a 29% target share last year. And then the other listed starters were Cameron Dollar, and then the final listed starter was Trey Good, who Trey Good is a guy that's been with this team for a while, but he's never really been on the field much. He joined Marshall in 2019, and he's apparently ascended the depth chart in camp. So Trey Good isn't a guy that has stats on the profile, but he's listed as a starter. So in GPPs, I like him. For just clear options, de facto players that are already in place, Victor Tucker is the guy here I would try to stack with Chris Reynolds. In the backfield, they're replacing a lot of production. Their only returner that has any sort of significant carries is Shadrack Bird. He is 4,200 on DraftKings. And then you have Calvin Camp. He is 3,400. Excuse me, Calvin Camp is the only one with any proven production. He's 19 carries for 86 yards in his career. And Bird is a transfer from Iowa. So he's a little bit of a higher recruit. But again, we don't know how this backfield shakes out. Charlotte does have a history of using a bell cow at times. So this is a spot you could potentially take a flyer on one of these guys. Duke also allowed over 200 rushing yards per game. So it's a spot that you could potentially look to exploit. But overall, I think the better plays in this game are at the running back position, mainly Durant, but taking a flyer on a potential Charlotte player here. The receiver is also in play with the total being pretty decent. Our next game, we're going to go to Old Dominion taking on Wake Forest. This is a potential blowout. Wake Forest a 31.5-point favorite. Old Dominion did not play football last year, so there's a lot to evaluate with this team. But historically, Old Dominion typically is very pass-heavy and pretty fast. Their lack of plays per game, in 2019, they were 54th. That typically comes from inefficiency, not an up-tempo style. They are going to try to push the tempo here, but likely going to struggle. So looking at Old Dominion, there's not a ton to look at for data because you have so many players getting replaced. They have former UCF signal caller Daryl Mack listed as co-starters with Hayden Wolf and Stone Smart. you could see all of these guys play, which kind of just makes it a position to avoid. I do think Mac is the best option, and he is a little bit of a dual threat. So if you're trying to just play one, it's Mac, but I would not recommend it. The backfield's also split. We're projecting to see Elijah Davis and Blake Watson, both of whom carried the ball a little bit in 2019. Neither had a significant role in the pass game. Price is enticing, but again, a very low implied team total. I think if you're taking a stab on any of these players, it's probably Aaron Moore, a receiver. He was the leader on this team in 2019. He had only a 13.5% target share, so this receiving core is still a little bit in flux. Nigel Fitzgerald is the next leading receiver on this team, but they did receive a West Virginia transfer in Allie Jennings, who's min price. He's a guy that has been productive in spurts, so that could be a spot you look at. But overall, trying not to get a lot of Old Dominion. For Wake Forest, it's a team we can certainly get to. Sam Hartman is not mobile whatsoever, but he's viable in stacks. The only issue I have with Hartman is he has to get these scores early. Wake Forest has shown a tendency to lean on the run when they are ahead, which makes a player like Christian Beal-Smith very attractive. They lost Kenneth Walker to transfer. He's now at Michigan State. That makes Christian Beal-Smith the favorite for carries this year, but Wake Forest has shown a tendency to use running back by committee. Christian Turner is a guy they may decide to use more, and even Justice Ellison popped up for some big games at times. So I wouldn't assume it's just Christian Beal-Smith out there for 25 carries. I think his touch range is between 15 to 20 on the higher end if they get up in this game, which they do project to do so. So Christian Beal-Smith, especially on DraftKings, where he's 6,400, is a very nice price adjusted play. In the receiving room, Wake Forest did narrow their target distribution with an injury to Donovan Green. He is out for the year. It's a guy that averaged 7 targets per game. Now, Jacare Roberson's the leader. He's their slot receiver. In the final 3 games Wake Forest played, he had 16, 14, and 16 targets. They target this guy frequently, averaged over 100 receiving yards per game and nearly 10 targets. He's one of the better receiving options on the slate with Wake Forest's high implied team total. The question is, does he get benched at halftime if they slaughter Old Dominion? Possible, but I think we saw some of that with some receivers last night, and overall in college football, this happens often. Roberson could get it done with efficiency in the first half and still be a fantastic play. Completely fine with him. The other clear listed starter was A.T. Perry, who's a little more affordable on both platforms. Prefer him on FanDuel. He should step up from his 11.5 target share he saw last year. The third starter was listed as a co-starting position between Taylor Morin and Donald Stewart. Stewart only had 8 targets last year, but Morin had 57. He'd be the option I look to first and foremost, but Stewart, you're going to get a little bit of a price break, and both will play. Wake Forest has a history of rotating receivers overall, so I think you can look at any of the top 4, but favorite play on the offense overall is still Christian Beal-Smith. And now, okay, we have some FCS teams to talk about. This is not going to be easy, so we're going to have to dig deep. Not a lot of stats to look at. Our first one, South Dakota taking on Kansas. It's a 14.5-point spread in favor of the Jayhawks. Jayhawks have a new coaching staff coming in Lance Leopold, and they actually recruited a little bit better than you might think. So I like the Jayhawks quite a bit here. Still, the total is really low, 54 points. Basically take South Dakota out of play, but you have the Jayhawks. Their implied team total is still north of 34 points, keeping them somewhat relevant. But starting with South Dakota, we'll try to break down this team and show you who the starters are. But it's a team very much at a deficiency here against Kansas, even though Kansas hasn't been great. Carson Camp is going to be the quarterback for South Dakota. He started last year as a true freshman. That was kind of a historic thing for South Dakota. He's labeled a dual threat by recruiting services, but he finished with negative 39 yards on the ground. That makes him pretty hard to target. Unless he can get it done with the ground, I think he's going to be a tough sell today, even though he's just 5K. Fortunately, the South Dakota team is really pass heavy, 61% pass rate. So you could maybe look to him in contrarian stacks. They'll be really cheap, but again, the implied team total is just 19.75 points. I'm not sure you want to get there with Camp, who's cheap. Their leading receivers are Caleb Vander Esch and Carter Bell. Vander Esch caught 23 passes, 273 yards. Bell caught 17 for 263. I think they're pretty clearly the top 2 options, 5,500 and 5,000 flat for them on DraftKings. Middling plays. The running back room looks like it's going to be a timeshare between Travis Thies and Shamari Lawrence. This will be led by Travis Thies, 37 carries, 161 yards, also caught 8 passes. Lawrence should play a change of pace role. But again, I don't think you're trying to get too much South Dakota with a low implied team total overall. Maybe stacks because they're pass heavy, but probably, if anything, they're just going to be run backs to your Kansas stacks if you use them. The issue with Kansas is they listed 3 starters on their depth chart at quarterback, co-starters, that is. You have North Texas transfer Jason Bean, Miles Kendrick, and the sophomore Jalen Daniels, who played a lot last year but did not play well. The best option, in my opinion, would be Jason Bean, who's got good dual threat ability, pretty efficient as a passer. They just haven't committed to him, which makes it very hard to stack Kansas overall. That's unfortunate because I have pretty clear receivers I want to use. Kwame Lassiter is 8,100 on DraftKings, which is an expensive price to pay for him, but he's a guy that averaged 7.3 targets per game in the final 4 games, and they actually are favored by 2 touchdowns here. You could look to the other listed starters. They're very cheap. Trevor Wilson and Stephen McBride were the other 2 players that they listed as starters. So Trevor Wilson is a transfer from Buffalo, obviously a holdover from the Leopold regime, comes over to Kansas, now projected to start. Min price for him is completely fine. You could play him in your lineups easily. Stephen McBride is a guy that only caught 3 passes last year, but he's ascended the depth chart, and he was listed ahead of their second leading receiver, Luke Grimm. So I think they're both options. Grimm would be a player that you use maybe in tournaments. In the running back room, Velton Gardner was listed as the clear starter, but Kansas has been a committee backfield to this point. Again, new coaching staff, and Leopold has used feature backs, including like Jarrett Patterson. They listed Amari Pesek-Hickson as the backup. Velton Gardner is a pretty good flyer in tournaments because of the high implied team total, and there is a chance he's used in that feature back role. He averaged 55 rushing yards per game last year. Somewhat decent pass catcher. So I think this is a spot to look at Gardner, look at some of the Kansas receivers that are really cheap. But overall, it's a game that's really hard to get to because of a low total on South Dakota side and a timeshare at quarterback for Kansas. Hopefully, again, Jason Bean can get that job to himself. Northern Colorado taking on Colorado. Maybe somewhat a rivalry. I don't know. It's a disaster of a game for Northern Colorado. They are 37.5-point underdogs. Totals 56.5. Northern Colorado is projected for 9.5 points in their implied team total. But what can we expect from this team? Well, it turns out a lot of players from Michigan transferred to this team. Dylan McCaffrey is a former Michigan signal caller. He's more of your pure dual threat. If you know the McCaffreys, you know Luke McCaffrey. Dylan McCaffrey is similar. Now, he is a 51 career completion percentage, but he's only attempted 35 passes. But that strong dual threat ability was evident. 166 yards on 23 carries with Michigan. He's still a tough sell just because Colorado is going to be a significantly better team than Northern Colorado. But maybe that dual threat is viable in tournaments. I would tend to lean against it. The top stacking options, if you do take the Dylan McCaffrey route, are Jaron Mitchell and Sam Flowers. They're the top 2 leading receivers. But again, if McCaffrey gets it done, it's probably with his legs. And this Northern Colorado team, they're moderate in pace, about league average. Their pass rate is above average, 54%. McCaffrey should be a boon to them. Their running back room is basically going to be True Wilson, another former Michigan player. Rushed 44 times for 221 yards in 2019, 62 times for 364 yards in 2018. Only 8 career catches, but I don't see any reason True Wilson shouldn't dominate the work in this backfield. Again, it's just they're implied for 10.5 points. So how much of this team do you really want to get? For me, not much, if any. On Colorado, their quarterback transferred out, so you get Brandon Lewis listed atop the depth chart as a starter, an unproven commodity overall, but somebody who has shown a semblance of dual threat ability in limited time. 73 yards on 9 rushing attempts last year. That's a massive implied team total he's playing under, 6,600 for him. Colorado is typically fast, 35th in plays per game, very high pass rate, north of 50%. Again, they probably lean a little run heavier in this game script, but Brandon Lewis with his dual threat ability, he probably has a longer time on the field compared to some other guys too, because he's not the clear starter. He won the job, but it was a battle between him and JT Shrout through most of camp. The running back room, they got a lot healthier. Jarek Broussard emerged last year. He's a smaller back. You would think more of a change of pace based on his size, but he rushed for 895 yards on 156 attempts. Decent pass catcher too, but that was because Alex Fontenot missed most of the year. Fontenot carried for 185 times, 874 yards in 2019. Jarek Broussard likely leads the backfield, but Fontenot is going to play a role a little bit. Even Ashad Clayton could get a few carries here, but Broussard in this game environment, nice play. Fontenot as well. Both are players you could look to. The receiving room, Dimitri Stanley is the returning leader, 18% target share for him, listed as a clear starter, as was Brendan Rice, 9% target share for him last year. The last spot was co-starters between Levante Chenault and Daniel Arias. So Chenault and Arias, I think, are both appropriately priced based on that depth chart listing. All of them are in play based on the enormous implied team total, but I think Colorado probably leans on the run here, looking more towards Jarek Broussard and Alex Fontenot overall. Again, it's still a team you want pieces of today because of the enormous implied team total overall. One game that is not featuring an FCS opponent, our one huge rivalry game on the slate tonight. Well, not our one huge, our other huge rivalry game on the slate tonight. Of course, there's UNC Virginia, but you have a Big Ten showdown between Michigan State and Northwestern. Michigan State was a team last year that underwent just enormous changes. Their coaching staff was completely different. They didn't have a long offseason to recruit, and COVID exacerbated some of those problems, but they showed growth throughout the year. They added a transfer at quarterback in Anthony Russo, and I think the best thing to say about Russo is he's more of a game manager type, so hopefully some of the turnovers that Rocky Lombardi produced are gone. But Russo completed 68% of his passes, 6.4 yards per attempt. He'll fortunately be playing with good receivers here. He's not really mobile, but Jaden Reed and Jalen Naylor are fantastic receiving options, and both of them are affordably priced here. The issue with the game overall is that you have Northwestern favored by 3.5 points, but the total is just 45.5 overall, so we're not expecting a lot of scoring. So I don't think it's a game where you want to fully stack outside of contrarian tournaments. Michigan State's implying team total 21 points. It's barely higher than teams like South Dakota. Now, Michigan State, very pass heavy. So some of these receivers like Jaden Reed, Jalen Naylor, they're averaging over 7 targets per game. Naylor averaged 7.9, Reed averaged 7.4. Both of them very efficient receivers. I certainly think they're the ones you prefer. The last starting receiver, it's not Ricky White. He's not with the team. It looks like it's going to be a timeshare between, and we'll see if this is true, Terry Lockett was listed as a co-starter alongside Trey Mosley. And perhaps one of these guys emerges, but right now it looks like it's a hard spot to target. Fortunately, both are really cheap. The running back room, they had a transfer in Kenneth Walker come over from Wake Forest. They had used a timeshare between Elijah Collins, Connor Hayward, who's dabbled at tight end this offseason, and Jordan Simmons. I think Walker's your best shot. He's 4,700 on DraftKings, which is where I prefer him based on price. But he's not a guy that's historically caught a lot of passes. I think Connor Hayward still probably plays in that role. It's tough to get to Michigan State as an underdog here against a pretty strong Northwestern defense. They do replace a lot, but overall an interesting spot to target. Not going to have a lot of Michigan State, and when I do, it's mostly going to be Reed and Naylor. On the Northwestern side, you had former Clemson transfer Hunter Johnson win the starting job over South Carolina transfer Ryan Holinsky. Hunter Johnson played poorly in spot duty in 2019, but it's a really small sample size, hard to take anything away from him. He did rush a little bit, 64 yards and 48 attempts. He's not going to be Lamar Jackson out there, but positive yardage, always good. I think he's maybe a contrarian stack to look at, but probably not going to get a lot of this game. Again, really low totals. They did add a Kansas transfer, Stephon Robinson at receiver. He's 6K. He should be working alongside Berkeley Holman and Bryce Kurtz. All middling plays at receiver. I would try to get to Robinson if playing one. The backfield is considerably narrowed based on the injury to Cam Porter, the transfer Isaiah Bowser, and Drake Anderson. So now you have Evan Hull projected to lead the team as the starter, and Andrew Clare, former Bowling Greenback, playing a change of pace role. Andrew Clare had 700 plus yards in his first 2 collegiate seasons. Good receiver out of the backfield, but he's been hurt since. Evan Hull was pretty efficient on a limited sample. He had 209 rushing yards and just 78 carries. I think both are solid options today. Preference towards Evan Hull, cheap on both platforms. But again, really poor game environment overall. Tough one to get to. And our final game, going back to the FCS level, we have South Dakota State taking on Colorado State. The game is a 52.5 total overall. Colorado State 2.5 point favorite, so a close projected spread. Just not a game that is dazzling by any means based on the total. But again, FCS level, so let's dig into South Dakota State. One of the better teams at this level of competition. You have Mark Goronski, the starting quarterback. South Dakota State, unlike South Dakota, is a slower, run-heavier team. Mark Gronowski is a player who passed for 1,564 yards, but he's a really strong dual threat. He finished with 577 yards on the ground and 7 touchdowns. He was the team's third leading rusher, and he's probably the top quarterback dual threat on this slate, just from pure dual threat ability. Now, the 2 stacking options, Jackson Yankee and Jaden Yankee, they're easily the top 2 receivers. You're looking to them if you're stacking this team. They finished with 25 and 25.5% target shares each. The backfield is going to be a timeshare between Isaiah Davis and Pierre Strong. Isaiah Davis, he was more efficient, but Pierre Strong had slightly more carries. I think both are fine in this situation. They're both affordably priced, but I like Gronowski as quarterback, cheaper option here. Colorado State pretty giving against the pass, stronger against the run. On the Colorado State side, you have dual threat quarterback Todd Centeio returning. He was a pretty inefficient passer last year, didn't even complete 40% of his passes, but he did throw for a decent amount of yardage in a small sample before he was injured. Good dual threat here as well, 92 rushing yards for him. The issue is this team is just so run heavy now, and they have 4 running backs they're going to use. Boston College transfer David Bailey transfers in. He was listed as co-starters alongside Jalen Thomas, Marcus McElroy, and Ajon Vivens. No interest in the situation until we figure out who is going to see a bulk of the carries. They're only GPP options. They don't throw a ton, but luckily their receiving room is pretty condensed when they do. They use a lot of 12 personnel, but Dante Wright's their leading receiver. Trey McBride's their hyper-athletic tight end. You had 28 and 34% target shares respectively for the 2. When they throw, it's mainly to those guys. EJ Scott's the seldom used wide receiver 3, 18% target share for him, but only averaged 16 yards, so a little bit to be desired. And then when they do have 3 receivers on the field, it's Jordan Kress who steps up. Probably not a main option. He's a transfer, but Jordan Kress, maybe somebody you look to in GPPs. I would rather just pay up for EJ Scott. But that does it for the slate overall. Everything you need to know. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Let me know your favorite plays. Of course, subscribe. Hit the thumbs up button on the way out. I'm Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. And we'll be back for Live Before Locks, more slate breakdowns, everything you need for college football DFS. So make sure to stick around.